Good morning, everyone. Hello. I would anticipate that we will have some folks walking in late because of the elevator situation, but we're going to go ahead and get started because we're just a few minutes over time. So good morning. Welcome to the Fall Title IV Child Welfare Dialogue. It's so fun. It's so energizing to see folks here in person after a couple years of Zoom only. And also, we're really glad that we can bring in folks by Zoom. We have people here from all over Wisconsin and some Minnesota folks as well on Zoom. So welcome. And thank you everyone for being here. So my name's Alice Egan. I'm the program coordinator for the Title IV Child Welfare Training Program. I'm also a 2003 alumni of our school. This child welfare training program has been in existence at the School of Social Work for over 20 years, and every year we train dozens of new child welfare trainees who are passionate about starting a new career in public child welfare. The dialogues that we hold each fall and spring are one of the many opportunities that our students have to receive some extra knowledge, information, and training that will assist them in their careers, as well as to share an opportunity with our community of social workers to learn together. A couple of quick housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. If you're joining us on Zoom, we will have somebody monitoring the chat. If you could do us a favor and only use the chat for questions or comments that you want passed on to the speaker, that will just help us keep track of those questions. And we will do that periodically throughout the event. So if you have a question, we will pause throughout for Dr. Renner to answer your questions. Often folks wonder or have questions about CEUs. If you're here in person, you'll have signed a sign-in sheet, and CEUs will be emailed to you within the next couple of weeks. If you're on Zoom, we have a log of everyone who has entered the Zoom room, and those CEUs will also be emailed to you, and it might just take a couple weeks, so be patient with us for that. Now for the main event, we're so pleased to welcome Dr. Lynette Renner from the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. Professor Renner is the Director of Graduate Studies and of the PhD program at the U of M. Her research focuses on intimate partner violence and child maltreatment, with particular attention to risk and protective factors, behavioral, mental health, and parenting outcomes, help-seeking strategies, and healthcare, legal, and therapeutic interventions. The goal of her scholarship is to support the well-being of children, adults, and families who experience interpersonal violence through the development and adaptation of interventions and cross-system partnerships. Dr. Renner is familiar with our school and our city as she's an alumni and earned her PhD in social welfare here. Dr. Renner, thank you so much for being here and welcome back.
Thank you all very much for having me. As Alice said, I am a graduate from the PhD program. I graduated here in 2005. This is my first time back on this campus, and I have to say, it all looks very familiar, which is nice. So I was in the School of Social Work yesterday, and it just felt like home. This is the first time I've presented in 3 years in person, so it's a little bit odd to actually see real live people. But thank you for coming, and thank you to those of you who are joining remotely. As Alice said, it's great that we can have this opportunity. I have some notes for myself to keep myself on track, but I look forward to our 90 minutes together. All right. Okay, maybe not. All right, I'll stop pushing it because clearly nothing's happening. Okay, success, great, okay, feeling good. All right, so just kind of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about intimate partner violence, give you a little bit of an overview of children's exposure to intimate partner violence, and then bring a little bit of information together about the intersection between intimate partner violence, or IPV, and the child welfare system. Most of the work that I do is related to protective factors, so I'm going to share 5 protective factors for intimate partner violence with you, and then for each one of those 5, just give a little bit of attention to some of the work that I've been doing, give us all something to think about. And then I want to end with a brief discussion on exposure to child maltreatment, or my area of particular interest, which is children who are exposed to the physical abuse of a sibling. I'm told that it's always good to say what people are hopefully going to walk away with, so here are the learning objectives for today. All right, before I officially begin, I want to give a few disclaimers and make some acknowledgments. So first of all, I want to draw the distinction between intimate partner violence and domestic violence. So I'm going to be using the term intimate partner violence. Work in this area, to my knowledge, the first article on this topic was published in 1960. It was by Leroy Schultz. It was called The Wife Assaulter. So wife assault was the terminology used at the time. That moved in then to being wife abuse and spousal assault. And soon after that, around the 70s, it became domestic violence. But for many people at the time, depending on kind of who you were kind of listening to, domestic violence oftentimes included more than violence between two adult partners. It really was meant to be covering things that were occurring in the home or the domicile. So it included other forms of maltreatment as well. So as we kind of moved along, intimate partner violence became what is termed by many people in practice and in research. And so that's what I'm going to be using. With that, intimate partner violence, or IPV, is violence, of course, between two people in an intimate relationship, not necessarily a sexual relationship. And it applies not only to a heterosexual relationship, and it includes not only a current relationship, but also people who were formerly partnered. Within IPV, I also want to differentiate between what some people term situational violence and what other people term coercive control. And what we mean most when we talk about intimate partner violence is an ongoing pattern of coercive and abusive behaviors meant to maintain power and control over another person. So by contrast, situational violence doesn't necessarily form a pattern, but often occurs when one or both partners handle conflict in a relationship with some form of violence. It doesn't mean that type, it's different from what we consider intimate partner or domestic violence, but it certainly doesn't mean that those acts are acceptable, and in many cases, it doesn't excuse the fact that there is a potential criminal behavior there. I want to acknowledge, of course, that all people of all sexes and genders experience intimate partner violence. There are several studies that actually document gender symmetry in the prevalence of intimate partner violence victimization, specifically between males and females. The National Intimate Partner Violence and Sexual Violence Survey, or NISVIS, shows that 47% of all females and 44% of all males report contact, sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner across their lifetime. I will speak, however, today primarily, I want to make that acknowledgement and then explain that I will primarily be talking about women today as being the people who experience intimate partner violence victimization. Although we do know that rates are similar, we do know that women are often, they experience significantly more intimate partner violence related injury, and there is just the element of gender-based oppression that is driving a lot of this behavior. My third disclaimer, victims and survivors. So unless, I rarely speak about people in terms of being victims or survivors. I generally use the term people who experience intimate partner violence. And I know everybody has kind of their own personal preference on that. So I probably won't say survivor or victim unless I'm referencing the work of somebody else. I've had a lot of women tell me that they don't like either label, and so therefore I just don't use either. The same with perpetrator or offender. I actually don't use those either, in keeping with kind of what I just said previously. I speak about people who use violence. And the last thing I want to say, I do realize this is a public child welfare dialogue, and I want to acknowledge that I have never worked within the child welfare system. So I don't come from that lens. I do a lot of cross-system work, so a lot of the things that I work on touch the child welfare system, touch the healthcare system, and touch the criminal and civil legal system. But I have not. I've worked in different systems, but not in the child welfare system. So my goal today is to not tell people how things should be within your organization and your system, but I hope that what I share today will have relevance for the work that you do as you work better to serve children and families. All right. This is my "we're transitioning now" slide, so you know a different topic is coming up. It's also my reminder to myself to breathe. So there we go. All right. I want to just mention the types of intimate partner violence. So physical, of course, things such as hitting and pushing and restraining and slapping and suffocating and strangling all fall in here. Sexual tactics, so thinking about rape or forced unwanted sexual practices are just some of those. Verbal and emotional, using degrading language, insulting, criticizing, name-calling, screaming at, harassing, using silent treatment. Psychological, related to isolation from resources, demands for subservience, monitoring somebody's time, making them account for their whereabouts. And entitlement behaviors sometimes go under that, treating somebody like a servant, making all decisions for another individual. Financial or economic coercion, preventing somebody from obtaining employment or education, withholding money from somebody, prohibiting access to family income or resources, making somebody beg for money, giving them an allowance, or stealing money. And then stalking, a variety of tactics, but really thinking about unwanted contact, including phone calls, text, contact through social media, sending unwanted gifts, showing up unannounced, again, monitoring and surveillance are in there. The majority of research when it first started was really focused on physical intimate partner violence, and the same with children's exposure to violence. It was really in physical intimate partner violence. But the prevalence of all of these kind of vary. Whoa. Okay, I think we're okay. So I just want to give some context to some numbers. So in their lifetime, 32% of females will experience physical intimate partner violence and 16% will experience sexual intimate partner violence. 1 in 15 women reported sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in the US in the last 12 months. Majority of women who are killed in our country are killed by a family member or an intimate partner, while 15% of men are killed in the US are killed by a family member or intimate partner. Data suggests that only about a quarter of intimate partner violence incidents are ever reported to police. Intimate partner violence is present, depending on kind of what studies you're looking at, between 1/3 and 2/3 of all child maltreatment cases. And while 25% of families receiving in-home services from the child welfare system report physical intimate partner violence, only 15% receive IPV-related services. Nearly half of all women, and depending on whose data you're looking at, many people would say it's a lot more than that, but about half of all women have experienced at least one form of psychological violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Between 94 and 99% of women who experience psychological or physical intimate partner violence, they also report some type of an economic abuse on top of that. Women and men who identify as bisexual have higher rates of intimate partner violence than people who report as heterosexual. And nationally, the highest rates of violence are among people who identify as multiracial, American Indian or Alaska Native, and as African American or Black. Significantly higher rates of intimate partner violence are reported among people who live in rural areas compared to urban areas. And probably not surprising to anybody is the plethora of effects that can result from experiencing intimate partner violence victimization. So these include a lot of physical health effects. So you find people with significantly more cardiovascular problems, a lot more chronic pain, a lot more headaches and migraines, a lot more gastrointestinal disorders, a lot of mobility issues, a higher risk for osteoporosis and stroke. A lot of mental health effects. The ones that come to mind most are depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and an increased risk for suicide. So, relational and social issues. Often people are isolated and don't have aren't able to maintain the same social and emotional functioning as they would normally would. Employment and education, I already mentioned, are ways of oftentimes people are cut off from those accesses. Isolation and limited access, I also mentioned, and I think financial, I already probably mentioned. I will say that the effects of intimate partner violence vary, of course, by what protective factors people have built into themselves, their families, their community, but the effects also vary with respect to the duration of violence that somebody experiences and the frequency of violence that somebody experiences. Kind of a side note, a lot of people will write about the frequency of violence being, and they'll speak about it in terms of more frequent violence equals more severe, or scholars often make decisions for women about which forms of violence are more severe. People will say sexual violence has to be the most severe form of violence, followed by physical. And I'll just say, I have actually conducted several studies where I ask women, what is the worst thing that's ever happened to you? And it's all over the map. For some women who've experienced both physical, sexual, and psychological, they will say it was the psychological. It was the day-to-day making me feel scared just by looking at me that was the most severe or the worst thing that ever happened to me. Other people will say the opposite. I only just wanted to make this side note because I am always annoyed when people will talk about severity in terms of making decisions for somebody else about what that is. Children's exposure to intimate partner violence. Over 15 million children live in families in which physical IPV occurred within the last year. It's estimated that between 16 and 25% of all children in our country are exposed to some form of intimate partner violence during their childhood. Each year, over 5% of youth report exposure to some form of psychological or emotional intimate partner violence. More than half of youth have witnessed intimate partner violence, have also experienced maltreatment in their lifetime. 1 in 5 children is exposed to family violence in their lifetime, including witnessing violence against a parent or sibling. And some studies show that up to 20% of substantiated referrals to Child Protective Services were related to children's exposure to intimate partner violence. Research on children's exposure to intimate partner violence is actually approaching almost the 50-year mark, with the first published case study detailing the negative effects of exposure to intimate partner violence that was published in 1975. And the first wave of empirical literature started appearing in the 1980s. One of the publications that I have always valued was written in 2003 by George Holden, and in it, Holden explains the 10 ways that children are exposed to intimate partner violence. So you can see that witnessing is only one of those 10 components. We often think about children witnessing or observing, and in fact, that's what a lot of people write about in terms of that must be the primary way that children feel the effects, right? They saw it, they were in the room when it happened. But I just wanted to draw your attention to this in the fact that there are many other ways that children are exposed to intimate partner violence, not just when they are directly witnessing or observing it. I also want to just mention the ways that children are oftentimes involved in intimate partner violence victimization. So one of the ways is that children sometimes are used as a tool by somebody who uses violence in custody arrangements, or the person who uses violence might make attempts to turn the child against the other parent. Sometimes children actually are engaged in the abuse. Sometimes the person who uses violence will ask children to agree with them in their verbal abuse of the other parent. Sometimes perpetrators may actually ask children to participate in the physical or sexual abuse of another parent. Children are often incorporated, have subtle tactics to use the children against the other person. Many women report that the person who used violence in their relationship attempts to undermine their authority as a parent. Children sometimes are asked to spy on their parent by a person who uses violence. Sometimes people who use violence try to manipulate their own time with children. So they refuse to show up on time for visitation. Sometimes they take more than their share. Sometimes they show unexpectedly and demand visitation, or refuse to return the children when their visitation has run out. Sometimes people threaten to harm the children, attempt to gain significant control over the other parent because they fear that their children will be hurt, kidnapped, or killed. This is something that I put together a couple years ago to show primarily what I wanted to show here is that children's effects of exposure to intimate partner violence vary by developmental stage. So intimate partner violence exposure in children is often linked to higher behavioral, emotional, social, and cognitive difficulties, also academic challenges as well. But it's important to note that the impact of those outcomes vary by children's age and developmental stage. I also think that it's worth really thinking about the potential that although these are broad consequences that are exhibited by many children, it's important to state that not all children will experience high levels of trauma burden and display significant behavior problems. It's important to recognize that many children who are exposed to intimate partner violence are actually pretty well adjusted despite what they have witnessed or what goes on in their home. And there is some research that shows that 37 to 50% of children exposed to intimate partner violence show no greater problems when compared with children who have no history of exposure. Many of you are probably familiar with the power and control wheel, and I only just wanted to briefly show this because it depicts how violence affects children. I think we've gone through most of these, so I'll just kind of give you a moment to look at it. Mic picks up everything. Okay. So along with that, I just wanted to draw attention to, so UNICEF made this list several years ago, and I still actually really like this list. It's pretty basic, but I think it's a nice reminder of some key needs for children exposed to intimate partner violence. So children need a safe and secure environment. They need the violence to stop. They need trusting and supportive adults who will listen to them, believe them, and shelter and care for them. Children need a sense of routine and normalcy. Children need support services that address the impact of intimate partner violence in the home. Children need to learn that intimate partner violence is never okay, and they need to be taught appropriate nonviolent problem-solving methods. Children need adults to advocate not only for their safety, but to raise awareness of the impact of intimate partner violence on children. As Alice mentioned in the introduction, a lot of the work that I do is related to help seeking. And when literature came out many years ago, several decades in fact, women were often kind of categorized as having this kind of learned helplessness. And they were often thought of, if they didn't leave their environment, then they really weren't doing anything to actively benefit their situation or to try to get the violence to stop or to mitigate the consequences for themselves and their children. And we know this not to be true. Women are very active in their help-seeking process and make a myriad of steps in order to protect themselves and their children or to get the violence to stop. Some of the things that women do are sometimes judged by people or are sometimes misunderstood or misinterpreted. So sometimes you will see that women actually keep the abuse secret. They aren't telling anybody. And for many women, this even includes their closest family members and friends. Sometimes they will avoid or lie to people, including family members and friends, and definitely including professionals when directly asked about the visible bruises or when asked about their experiences. Women will try to distract or soothe their children in an effort to normalize what's going on in their family. Women will arrange for their children to spend time outside of the home as a way to protect them. I've talked with a lot of women who this next bullet point really speaks to. So again, kind of thinking about how children are used within a violent relationship. Sometimes women will be asked, do you want to have, is it going to be you or is it going to be the kids? So in an effort to protect children, women will endure greater incidents of physical assault or sexual assault. Many women turn to alcohol or drugs as one means to numb their own pain and to try to get some relief from what they're experiencing. Women often display resistance strategies, and so many of them will use physical force against their partner as a way to defend themselves or their children, knowing that they often incur greater injuries as a result of doing so. Some women, again, given the choice, am I going to discipline the kids or are you? Some women will discipline their children, sometimes physically, even if they really don't want to, as a way of getting in the way of what they fear will be a worse punishment by the person who uses violence. And many women will stay with or return to a partner to avoid being stalked or to avoid the escalation of violence if they're living apart. Women are at a greater risk for violence and a more substantial risk for homicide when they leave that relationship. And that actual greater risk occurs for, some people will say 2 years, other people will say up to 5 years after that separation. So this gets into, well, why do they stay? So many women stay in a violent relationship because they're worried. First of all, many women have nowhere else, or they feel they have nowhere else to go. Finding adequate and affordable and stable housing is really a challenge for many women. And so many people feel stuck. They fear that their partner who uses violence, many people fear that they will kidnap their children or that they will be granted sole custody. Many people worry that they will be unable to monitor their partner's contact with their children. If I separate and he has visitation, I don't know what's going on there. If I'm under the same roof with everybody, as bad as it is, at least I understand how he's interacting with our children. And again, many people fear that they will be stalked, assaulted, or killed. with every help-seeking kind of decision that people make, particularly, I would say every decision, but especially around possibly exiting a relationship, women go through a cost-benefit analysis. So imagine somebody asking them, if I leave, what's the benefit? I think for many people that's obvious, but the cost, what is the cost if I actually leave? And those are many of the things that are on this slide, but there's certainly a lot more to that, and that often keeps people in that relationship. It's kind of a side note. So one of the things that I've done is I conducted a study. I'm always interested in why people think the abuse in their relationship started. And so I'm interested in women's attributions to that. And so I did a study. I interviewed over 100 women, and I asked them, why do you think the abuse in your relationship started? And that all kind of boiled down into kind of three larger areas. One was being that they thought my partners need to control, right? That's just him. It's his whole essence and personality, so it's coming out in our relationship. The second category was emotional dysregulation. A lot of people talked about the fact that their partner can't handle stress at work, and it comes out into my home, and it comes out and it's on me. Or their partner has a lot of challenges around substances or mental health, and so all of that is kind of, it's his issue, right? His kind of individual kind of pathology, and it's coming out in our relationship. And the other third and pretty prominent theme was that it's learned behavior. Like, he grew up in this environment. This is how it was modeled to him to treat a woman, to treat a partner. I then asked women why they thought the abuse continued. And I was expecting a similar result to the question of why it started, right? All things attributed kind of to him, right? His need for control, his inability to handle stress, or his excessive use of substances, or his home environment contributed to this. To my shock, only about a third of the women kind of reverted back to their original explanation for why this happened. The rest of them all said it was something that it continued because of me. So they blamed themselves for the relationship, that they didn't take the sufficient actions to stop the abuse. So it was something that they failed to do, despite having tried literally 1,000,006 things. They just didn't have that one magic thing that made it stop. Or they blamed themselves for not leaving. And I have to say, one of the things that I find that to be so interesting is that my hunch is that that shift also includes some interesting societal messages. I think that there's a lot of messaging to women, particularly when they contact with professionals who might not exactly understand the nuance and the dynamics of an intimate partner violent relationship, that they are often given the messages of, well, if you leave, or that's the only way this is going to get better, is you have to leave. So, sorry, that was a long side note, but there you go. Okay. Talking a little bit about, more intentionally, the connection between intimate partner violence and child maltreatment. Approximately 30 million children in the U.S. Will be exposed to some type of family violence before turning 17. And again, depending on who you read, about 30% to 60% of families where IPV is identified also experience some form of child maltreatment. And in the late 80s, an article came out to really kind of draw attention to what to children who are both exposed to intimate partner violence and experience child maltreatment. And it was called the double whammy. And it was really, this article in this body of literature is really putting forth the fact that it's kind of a dose effect, right? It's bad to experience one or the other. It's far worse to experience the two of those in combination. Child Protective Services and domestic violence programs, as most of you probably know, have historically responded separately to children and adults who experience family violence. For caseworkers, the legal mandate is the protection of the child who is maltreated, and responding to domestic violence has sometimes been viewed by some people as a peripheral issue, and definitely a complicating factor. And alternatively, domestic violence advocates primarily focus on pursuing safety and empowerment for the adult who experiences violence. And while the two different perspectives may guide child protection and domestic violence systems, I do believe that both systems share a common goal of protecting children and families from current and future violence. However, for many people in the field, the practice and policies that are in place for children and families, for many people, they operate either, it's pretty simplistically, but they operate from a punitive framework or a supportive framework. And the supportive framework is characterized by a conditional approach to intimate partner violence-related harm, an approach to responsibility that focuses on the person who uses the violence, and interventions meant to augment efforts to keep children safe, and differential consequences for people who use violence and for people who experience violence. And at the federal level, the Green Book Initiative was the first significant attempt to encourage child welfare agencies, domestic violence advocates, and the court system to address the intersection between child welfare and domestic violence. And they came up with several principles that emerged from that work, addressing the issues of domestic violence in families who come to the attention of child welfare agencies. And the first is that experiencing intimate partner violence does not automatically equate to being a neglectful parent to one's child. Child welfare agencies can best protect children by partnering with adults who experience intimate partner violence and by offering appropriate services and protection. And that interventions should focus on assessing the behavioral profiles of people who use violence and creating strategies for intervention that place the burden for change on the person who uses violence. And that separating mothers from their children should be the alternative of last resort. So that was in 1999. All these years later, in 2019, the Quality Improvement Center on Domestic Violence and Child Welfare was established, and they came out with guiding principles for what they call the Adult and Child Survivor Center approach. And the first one is collaboration. Collaboration among multiple partners is essential to more effectively promote the safety of child and adult survivors and accountability for the person using violence. And a variety of sectors need to work together as collaborative partners in order to help facilitate a journey that is more toward more safe and stable conditions, more healing conditions, and greater well-being. And this includes not only domestic violence programs and child welfare and the courts, but also law enforcement, public housing, the educational system, and the healthcare sector. The second principle is connectedness. The safety and well-being of children and adults who experience intimate partner violence are inextricably linked. Intimate partner violence can negatively impact both children and adults, and improving outcomes for both of them requires domestic violence to be treated as a family matter, where the safety, healing, and well-being of all members are addressed. The third is planning with survivors. Children and adults who experience intimate partner violence are safer and better off when planning is conducted with them and when it integrates their own preferences and perspectives. Collaborative partners should work closely with children and adults to craft safety and case plans that consider both research-based indicators of risk, but also their own knowledge and perspectives. And these should be monitored and modified over time. The fourth principle is unique strengths and challenges. Planning and interventions should integrate family member strengths. They should support nurturing the parent-child relationship and address the family's unique contexts and challenges. The fifth is equity. Domestic violence and child welfare practitioners and their collaborative partners should actively work toward racial, ethnic, and gender equity in practice, as well as in families' access to resources. There is a lot of evidence of structural racism and other social inequities and institutional biases built within many of our systems, which families often find themselves. In order for families to thrive, collaborative partners should actively work at individual, institutional, and community levels to maximize access to resources and services, and to understand the inequities that people face when implementing strategies. And the final principle is focused on healing and well-being. Domestic violence and child welfare practitioners and their collaborative partners must actively promote the healing and well-being of adults and children, and also the person who uses violence. Focusing on risk factors should not singularly determine planning and interventions. Strategies must focus on building protective factors for adults and children. And this is just one other example. I'm looking at the time, so I'm not going to go through all of this. But some of that is already subsumed in what we've already talked about. But really thinking about working through improving outcomes for children, youth, and families impacted by violence as a partnership, really through the lens of equity, which I also mentioned. Storytelling is a little bit different from the other one, but really capturing stories and thinking about not just using risk-based assessments or not just using checklists of risk factors, but really listening to people, listening to their lived experiences, and capturing stories that capture a wide range of interpersonal, cultural perspectives and a variety of research and evaluation approaches. That kind of goes along with the centering lived experiences, really thinking about that people should be the drivers of next steps in their own lives and their own healing journey. Healing, multiple pathways for healing, multiple options. Accountability, establishing practices that really center around the person who uses violence and the potential for repairing harm caused by that individual and also systems, and then building safety. This was put out a couple years ago by some authors and published by the Children's Bureau. The top is cut off. So the top heading is Strategies for Child Welfare Agencies to Work Collaboratively with Domestic Violence Advocates. And then the bottom section is Strategies for Domestic Violence Advocates to Work Collaboratively with Child Welfare Agencies. And really, again, kind of just, I think this is not magical, and it really goes back to what things were put out in 1999 with the Green Book, which is really thinking about joining multiple systems as a joint collaboration, and not just thinking about you do this part and then you do this part, and kind of all sometimes challenges and good stuff, but sometimes challenges kind of come in the middle, but really thinking about learning each other's role, understanding each other's perspective, and trying to address the co-occurrence of intimate partner violence and child maltreatment through joining of multiple systems together, not just certain systems taking certain parts. And so along with that, I just wanted to mention that some people have talked about doing this work and having these systems joined together by having a co-located model. So co-located staff are typically trained domestic violence service providers employed through a local domestic violence agency, but spending time in and working in a child welfare office and really kind of working with child welfare workers on cases that involve intimate partner violence. Other people use a domestic violence consultant model, and with this approach, the child welfare agencies typically hire a domestic violence consultant, somebody who often trains their staff, coaches their staff on ways to potentially improve practice for cases that involve intimate partner violence, and really kind of bringing that lens of looking at the family as a whole. I'm in Minnesota, and Minnesota has, we've experienced in one county, we had a co-located model for quite a while that actually doesn't exist anymore. A lot of challenges in having a co-located model, although I love the idea. In practice, it becomes quite a bit of a challenge. And one of the biggest things was that the person who was the domestic violence advocate often felt that kind of the whole child welfare system, they often felt like they were exasperating a whole lot of efforts and energy, and it just wasn't going anywhere. So they had some significant issues of turnover, and they could not keep anyone in that environment. Hospital settings also try to do a lot of co-located work. Also, there's a lot of medical legal partnerships, and those system examples, I love all of those. That's kind of like the pie in the sky, because those have so much promise, but in practice, really hard to get off the ground and maintain. So some people do the consultant model. In Minnesota, we have something called a rapid consultation system, and that's a helpline where child welfare workers can call and speak with someone who is a DV advocate. Usually within a few hours, they can call and get somebody to advise and consult on their case. Minnesota also uses their continuous quality improvement unit. They review all of the screening decisions that involve intimate partner violence, and then they reach back out to the counties to discuss decisions that they believe are not within the best practices guidelines that our state has put forth for how to work with intimate partner violence and child maltreatment. Sorry, that's loud. I titled this one, I'm wondering if I'm completely missing that. The very first article that I ever wrote that was kind of on the intersection between intimate partner violence and child maltreatment, I was a professor at the University of Missouri in Columbia, and I interviewed foster care workers and supervisors about kind of just the presence of intimate partner violence, and that was a quote that I took from that article. So it was 2011, and there was not nearly as much attention, despite the fact that the Green Book had been around for a couple decades, still not nearly enough attention on the co-occurrence between the two. And a lot of the workers felt like I'm sure it's there, but I'm really not doing anything to ask about it, and so I'm wondering if I'm just entirely missing it. Although tensions frequently arise between people who are in the intimate partner violence or DV field and people who are in this child welfare system over who should kind of be served, like who's my primary client, is it the adult or the child? The prevalence, of course, as we know, that the co-occurrence necessitates some kind of coordinated effort to really address the family violence through a holistic lens and through holistic practices. Child welfare workers often report that they feel a lack of preparation and a lack of confidence in not only assessing but also addressing intimate partner violence, even when their best practice guidelines, mandate that they do so. And one study of mothers from the child welfare or child protective system, a quarter reported an incident of IPV in the last 12 months, but of those cases, only 32% reported receiving a referral to any IPV-specific resources. And this was attributed both to a lack of even identifying IPV by child welfare workers, but also, in a different issue, as the lack of availability of IPV-specific services. I'm going to go through this quickly, but one of the things that the QIC did a few years ago is they pulled together professionals from the child welfare system, the DV system, and also families who had been served by those systems. And they pulled together a list of things that came out of that in terms of both kind of that covered challenges and also recommendations. So improved service infrastructure, the current system infrastructure often, for many people in the child welfare system particularly, there's a lack of adequate staff training and supervision. And current assessment practices sometimes gloss over differences in families experiencing IPV, and the differences may have important implications for appropriate interventions. There's also a lack of available services for people who use violence. It's definitely identified as a need. And frontline workers had often a significant barrier in the system's response to families experiencing IPV. System challenges were a high staff turnover rate and frequent changes in agency leadership. People felt that it made it very difficult to develop some strong collaborations between child welfare and the domestic violence organizations. And also a lack of understanding each agency's priorities and specific mandates. Of course, agencies that address intimate partner violence sometimes have different mandates, and they may not respond in an integrated way to the needs of all family members. So having supportive policies, agencies must have policies that prioritize safety and well-being for the child and the adult, and those policies and practices need to hold people using the violence as the ones who are accountable for that behavior and what is going on in that family system. I also mentioned previously the discrimination based on gender, race, class, immigration status are present in many systems that respond to intimate partner violence. And IPV advocates and child welfare staff need to deepen their understanding of multiple oppressions that limit options for mothers and families of color. Women often report feeling very misunderstood, blamed, and forced to do things that they believed would make them less safe because the child welfare worker did not fully understand how intimate partner violence affects their family. Women with lived experience of IPV and who have child welfare system involvement report that the assessment process makes them feel unseen as individuals and often overlooks their unique circumstances. Workers report to this kind of theme of being good or doing the right thing emerges, and workers wish that to do the right thing, they want to be good provide good child protection practices. They want to assess risk and respond in ways to make children safer. And women also report wanting to do the right thing in the eyes of their worker, even while feeling misunderstood and blamed and forced in the process. And I think I've mentioned this enough. Women feel that their personal experiences and circumstances are not considered. There are a lot of mixed opinions concerning whether the potential harm from children's exposure to intimate partner violence merits codification as an actionable form of child maltreatment in law or in formal child welfare policy. Throughout the 1990s, research on exposure to intimate partner violence harm led to expanded definitions of neglect and increased in IPV-related referrals to child welfare. And this research it contributed to policies and practices that held both the person who used violence and the person who experienced violence accountable for any harms that were thought to have happened to the children. So when children were present, adults who experienced IPV were often substantiated for failure to protect or neglect of a child and subject to consequences like removing the child from the home and the termination of parental rights. Interventions based on that framework also sought to enhance child safety by preventing further exposure to intimate partner violence, which was often conceptualized as being inevitable unless the person who experienced violence and the person who used violence were permanently separated. So along with this, some states made increased efforts to classify exposure to intimate partner violence in and of itself as a type of maltreatment. And many that did, Minnesota included, many that did ended up changing course, largely due to the substantial increase in cases that essentially flooded the child protective system. And in 2004, many of you probably know about the Nicholson and Scopetta case in the New York District Court. But the grounds for removal from children from their custodial mother was because she was assaulted by another individual and deemed to have failed to protect her children from being exposed to that. But the judge determined that the city may not penalize a mother, not otherwise unfit, who is battered by her partner by separating her from her children, nor may her children be separated from the mother, in effect visiting upon them the sins of their mother's batterer. I made this little map, and I hope I got all 26 states on there. As of January 2021, 26 states in the U.S. have addressed in statute, they have addressed children's exposure to intimate partner violence, so it's defined in statute. The majority of those states, though, use this although they constitute what is exposure, the majority of them they use this for criminal penalties. So they cite the presence of a child as being an aggravating circumstance in a criminal case for domestic violence assault, yielding harsher penalties. And a few states, I thought this was interesting, a few states require the person who used intimate partner violence to pay for counseling for a child who is exposed to intimate partner violence if they require any. I know of 2 states, and some of you might know of a couple others, but I believe Utah and West Virginia might be the only states that actually classify exposure to intimate partner violence as a specific type of child maltreatment. In most states, exposure to IPV is nested within the dominant child maltreatment typologies, typically in neglect, failure to protect, something like that. So we talked a little bit about this kind of punitive consequence, so thinking about exposure to intimate partner violence as the neglect of or the failure to protect of the mother as the person who's using violence. Contrasted that with the last several decades of literature promoting a supportive framework. And so several people have looked recently and just asking the question, is a supportive framework actually being applied within the child welfare system? And so the conclusions are that the child welfare cases involving intimate partner violence continue to produce punitive consequences for people who experience intimate partner violence. This occurs, however, despite the fact that many counties, many organizations actually have written policies that are far more in line with the supportive framework that's outlined in the Green Book and other areas. And those policies are supposed to emphasize responsibility of IPV-related harm to the person who uses violence. So one can conclude that the availability of supportive guidelines alone does not ensure their use. And many states really just continue to struggle with a lot of these questions. I love the fact that this is framed as a dialogue, because this, I think, is where a lot of people are having these ongoing dialogues and have been for quite some time. So is intimate partner violence in the home, is it automatically a threat to a child's safety? Is exposure to intimate partner violence actually a failure to protect a child? When there are allegations made, against whom does that need to be? And whom is it in practice? And do those things even match? And in the context of someone else's choice to use violence, what can we expect and what should we ask of the person who experiences violence? And I was talking to somebody just a few days ago in Minnesota who this is their last question is what I put up here. She said she's constantly asking herself, are our current practices making moms safer, or are we actually putting them in more danger? So Alice, I'm looking at the time. I got a long way to go, so I'm gonna just I meant to have a lot of opportunity for dialogue in this, given it's a child welfare dialogue. However, in my usual, I over-prepared for pretty much everything. I'm just going to move through if that's okay. Sorry about that. I did not mean to talk at you for 90 minutes, so I truly apologize. But had we had time, I know there's a lot of amazing things happening out there, so I was just going to ask you, following that supportive framework, maybe you can just think about this on your own. So what do you and your organization do well to support children exposed to IPV and adults who experience IPV? But of course, along with that, what are some of those challenges that you face when trying to support children and adults? And then the ongoing question that I think a lot of us ask are, what do we need to be better equipped to meet the needs of adults who experience ITV and the needs of children who are exposed? Okay. All right. Well, we are at, oops, the second thing I was going to talk about today. So the first one took a long time. Sorry about that. Second thing, and I'll try to zip through this a little bit, although I don't want to undermine the importance of protective factors, so maybe I shouldn't say I'm going to zip through it. But a couple of things that I want to just point out here and draw your attention to each of these, because I'm going to talk about each of them with a research example. Again, the QIC a couple years ago published a great document, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to take a peek at it. But they really highlighted 5 interrelated protective factors that apply to both adults and children. So really advocating for and thinking about ways for in practice and policy to create safer and more stable conditions, to really take advantage of and enhance social, cultural, and spiritual connections, to really think about resilience as a growth mindset, to nurture parent-child interactions, and to enhance social and emotional abilities. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So as I already mentioned, one of the things that I do some work in is women's help seeking, and I know, and I know you probably know, that women engage in a myriad of strategies to cope with or stop or prevent the violence. And they try literally everything under the sun, in my opinion. Research on help seeking often differentiates between what is a public help seeking effort, so what is somebody's actual reaching out to somebody, whether that be an informal network through friends or neighbors or coworkers, or reaching out to the formal system, whether that be law enforcement, medical professionals, counselors, shelters, those types of things. The most commonly reported thing that women do is reach out to informal supports and really look at their friends and families. And one of kind of like my dream ideas, I do a lot of work in suicide, and we are often training people on how to respond to disclosures of suicide because family members hear those first. One of my dream things, and bystander interventions is kind of a similar kind of like thinking about, one of my dream things is to really build something up so people who are informal supports for somebody who experiences violence is to try to build up that network. So anyway, another side note. Women often use formal supports less frequently than informal support. Sometimes it's an access-related issue. Sometimes the person who uses violence is actually cutting them off from some of those formal sectors. But women also have many women have tried, and it's kind of like if women reach out to things that they think, of course, are going to be accessible and when providers are going to be helpful. And women often encounter people in formal service sectors that they do not believe will help them, and so that kind of limits some of what they do. Or they try, and that exchange goes horribly wrong, and they just simply take that as a message to, I'm not going to try that ever again. Surviving and thriving theories. So survivor theories hold that women who experience violence engage in active help seeking, which we know that they do. But the gap between staying in an abusive relationship and leaving it is really kind of filled in, and it's based on the amount of positive support and services that they believe are available to them. Thrivership theories build on that, and they posit that there's 3 essential elements that women really need to thrive after experiencing relationships that include intimate partner violence. The first is the provision of physical and emotional safety. The second kind of goes with a theme that we've already heard, which is storytelling and truly being heard and seen as a unique individual. And the third is based on a social response, and social responses such as positive interactions from professionals who validate a woman's experience really actually further enable and reinforce women's ability to thrive. A couple years ago, when I was a professor at the University of Iowa, I had a multi-year study funded by the National Institute of Justice, and I was able to interview 150 women over the course of, every 6 months over the course of 2 years, who were seeking civil legal services through Iowa Legal Aid. So they were looking at, they were obtaining either a protective order or obtaining a divorce or working through child custody issues. And I was able to have them take a measure of intimate partner violence strategies, so assessing about 39 things that they have tried to stop or cope with or prevent the violence in categories of formal network, legal network, safety planning, informal network, resistance, and placating. So women were asked if they've ever used each of these strategies, and then if they had, they were asked to rate how helpful they were. And I just want to highlight a couple things. So again, this was 150 women. So if you look at just the placating strategies, so trying to avoid him, trying to keep things quiet, doing whatever he wanted, trying not to cry, because that often incites more violence. And the resistance strategies, trying to leave the relationship, fighting back verbally, fighting back physically, standing up and refusing to do what he said, or actually using or threatening him with a weapon. You can see 149 out of the 150 women have used strategies from these two situations. For most women, again, this is kind of that element of privacy. I'm not going to involve anybody else. I'm going to try to take care of this on my own. Most women have done this. I've done other studies that use a similar measure. This is most women's go-to. Most women, if you look though on a scale from how helpful is this, from a 1 to a 1 being not helpful, 5 being very helpful, for most women they're futile efforts, right? It actually doesn't change anything, but this is where most people go to. Informal strategies are used by a lot of women, and this is actually kind of going back to what I said before, which is like, how do we build up informal networks? A lot of women find these to be very helpful. So either at 4 out of 5 or pretty close to. And particularly the things they find most helpful are when they actually are able to talk with their family and friends about what to do to protect themselves and their children, or when they're actually sending their kids away from the home to be with family or friends or relatives. What women don't find particularly helpful are most of the things in the formal network, except for, and this bears out in other work that I've done, women who stay in shelter actually find that to be extremely effective. But then if you look at how many people used it, out of the 150 women in my study, only 20. So very helpful, but also very underutilized, which is probably not surprising. And this was a study with women who were seeking legal aid services, so I don't want to overinflate kind of the importance of filing a protective order. However, other work that I've done certainly shows this out. What I did that I've never seen any other scholars do who use the intimate partner violence strategies inject is actually then go back and ask, so why were these helpful or why were these not helpful? And of the women who found these strategies to be the most helpful, women who believed that staying with having people go, their children stay with or talk with family members were helpful, is because one woman told me, my family and friends reinforced that there is help available, and they told me to not be afraid to leave. So getting that additional encouragement. Other women told me that their family or friends gave them financial, emotional, and physical support, and they kept affirming to me that I was making the right decision. Of the women who found it most helpful for their children to be sent elsewhere, women believe that this was helpful. One woman said, it kept my children from seeing anything or getting hurt. Another woman said, it made me feel better that my son wasn't exposed to the violence on a daily basis anymore. If I couldn't help myself, at least I could help him. And for women who thought that ending the relationship was the most helpful action that they eventually took, one woman said, it got me and my kids out of a bad situation. I didn't want my kids growing up and thinking it was okay. And one woman simply said to me, if I hadn't ended the relationship, he would still be beating me up. Things that were the least helpful, not surprisingly, most women said the least helpful thing that they ever tried was fighting back, either physically or verbally. One woman said it only escalated things. Another woman said it never helped, and it wasn't the wisest decision, but it sure did make me feel better for a moment. And one woman said it only made him hit me harder, but I swore I would never let him know. I was so scared. So honestly, I would go toe-to-toe with him every single time. In terms of avoiding their partner, most women said that it never changed anything. One woman said, he always found something to nag at me about anyway, so when I avoided him, I was only delaying the inevitable violence. And calling the police for many women was one of the least helpful things that they did. Most women said something along the lines of that they were never taken seriously, their partner was never arrested, and the police never made him leave the home. I have this quote at the bottom. One woman didn't really answer my questions, which I always love when people do that, because then they're telling me what they think is most important. And she said, this is what she said: women actually just need money to get out of the house or to get him out. You need people who know legally how to get him out. Him getting arrested for the abuse will get him out of the house for a day, but then he goes back, and the abuse will be worse. A woman has to be stable financially and emotionally so the court will support her. But by that time, you're already cut off from people who could have helped you, your family, your friends, and any acquaintances that he already saw as a threat. We're still on the first protective factor. Prepared way too much. I'm so sorry. I just want to quickly, I'll do this quickly. Again, I just want to really draw to the attention of the fact that not only are women really trying a lot of things to stop the violence, but they are also trying a lot of things to economically try to figure out what puts them in a better situation. A lot of women stay due to a lack of financial resources, but another study that I did really looked at what happens to women once they do leave that relationship. And I just want to point out to the fact that a lot of women are able to better their economic circumstances. They don't know that, of course, at the time, but it can come to fruition for many women. And one of the studies that I did for women of lower income who were receiving civil legal aid is that their monthly income over the first year of leaving that relationship had actually significantly increased. Their program assistance utilization, so relying on food stamps or other things like that, actually decreased, which is not always because they're in a better situation. Some of those things, of course, are income dependent, so some of them they weren't able to qualify for anymore. But I also asked them how difficult it is to live on their income, and that actually became less difficult for them over the time as well. Women also reported simultaneously that they had better family resources as they kind of moved through that as well. So I just wanted to kind of make that little bit of plug. And another slight side note, this was a study that I did with women who were experiencing intimate partner violence and then seeking assistance through the civil legal system, specifically through legal aid. I also did a analysis on social return on investment for that. And the estimate for the total economic impact relative to finding out how many attorney hours were spent on every single case. And the effect of that was actually 141%, meaning that women's income increased $2.41 for every dollar that was spent on legal aid services. So if you really think about that, that is quite a, that's quite a bang for the buck, right? So that's a pretty substantial element. The problem is that the U.S. expenditures on civil legal aid is less than 1/7,000th of 1% of our gross domestic product. So we lag behind pretty much every industrialized country in the world. And as I have a colleague who does a lot of work within the civil legal system, and what he always likes to tell me is that Americans spend actually as much on Halloween costumes for their pets as our federal government spends on legal aid services. So there you go. Not anything I think we should be proud of. Social, cultural, and spiritual connections. So healing from violence, as we know, is possible. We also do know that we don't spend enough time really thinking about what actually it takes for people to, how is recovery achieved and how is it sustained? And so I just want to bring a couple of quotes to highlight this from a study that some colleagues and I did with women in Missouri, living in rural areas of Missouri. And it kind of came down for them into three kind of buckets that I think highlight these social, cultural, and spiritual connections. One woman, several women talked about their relationship to a higher power, and one woman said, "I've always believed that things happen for a reason. I mean, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's just what I think. I've been through a lot. I've been through some things that a lot of people can't make it through, and I ask myself, how can I be so forgiving to people for what they've done to me, and how did I manage to make it so far? The only answer I can come up with is by the grace of God. I don't know how else to explain it." And one of the things that came from this work is we actually developed an assessment tool for really focusing on women's spiritual connections within their resilience process. And so if anyone's interested in that, I can pass along that article. Other women talked about what we sort of expected, which is kind of this bucket of informal networks being a source of their recovery process. One woman said, "It's hard to bounce back and get the strength to believe in myself again, but I was able to have a good support background. I feel sorry for anyone out there who doesn't have a loving family, because it's going to be your main strength. I went from wanting to kill myself every day, right now, just being able to stand up and say, hey, I'm me, and I love myself. It was really hard to go from one point to the other without support." And then in that public help seeking in that formal network, one woman said, "Asking for help is one of the hardest things a person can do, but it's one of the best things a person can do. Because you can find out that there's something else out there, that you don't have to hurt all the time. You don't have to be demeaned in various ways. You don't have to be in the hospital with a broken arm and say that you fell down the stairs. There's another way to live, and they can help you find that way to live and show you how." The third protective factor is having resilience and a growth mindset. And I want to highlight that practitioners can really play a role here in promoting a survivor's growth mindset by working in ways that are empowering and future-oriented and hopeful. Going back to my legal aid study, one of the things that we found when we looked at women's measures of mental health symptoms and resilience and goal-directed thinking and empowerment, we saw significant decreases in the 1 year post leaving a violent relationship, where women were reporting significantly less depression symptoms and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. I was hoping to find higher levels of resilience, but what I actually learned was this was a pretty resilient group of women anyway. And so they had consistently high measures of resilience over time. But the last one is they reported significantly more empowerment, as feelings of empowerment. And when I talk with women about what part of a driver in this, it was really, they usually went back to their relationship with their attorney, which I think can translate into almost any other professional helping relationship. But women talked a lot about having the support of an attorney, having someone who listened to them, continually showed up for them. And for many women, they described having somebody stand up for me in a courtroom against my partner and his fancy attorney, is what most women would tell me. That was extremely empowering to them. So again, I think that supporting women in this way is something all professionals can do. Nurturing parent-child relationships, a lot of the work that I do is around women's parenting and how do women parent in the context of violence. Many women describe that their identity as a mother was something that was stolen from them by the person who has harmed them. And we do know that, of course, emotional and physical effects of intimate partner violence can leave women exhausted, and some people really report that they have limited energy to give to their children. Women struggle with feelings of guilt and trying to compensate in many times for the adverse effects of violence on their children. But women always tell me that they have a strong desire to be a good mother and to serve as a role model for their children. And many women report increased caring and empathy and protective feelings toward their child, suggesting that they develop positive parenting strategies in order to attempt to reduce the consequences of violence. Many women struggle. They have a desire to communicate with about intimate partner violence with their children in the hope of preventing their children from experiencing future violence. One of the things that one of the studies that I did was really focused on women's changes in how they view their role as a mother, challenges in the mothering role, and the importance of being a mother. And in terms of their role, many women talked about being a provider, a nurturer. They talked about being a discipliner, being that person who is providing security and stability. One person simply said, "I want to be a hero to my children." Challenges in the role, one woman said, "I feel very broken, but I'm taking steps to remedy that. I realize it's a process, but I am making good choices." And women talked about the importance of being a mother, and this was in every single interview, and one woman summed it up extremely well. She said, "This is the role that I live for. There is no point in being in my life besides being a mom." And I think I mentioned this earlier, but one of the, I do some work, and I think I mentioned that I asked women what is the worst things that they've experienced. For some women, it is all the things that you would expect it to be. And I've taken their words and their examples, and I've written and presented on several things where, in my mind, some of the things women experience literally equates to torture. And I've made many presentations about that. But for other women, it really kind of goes back to some of the worst things that they've experienced are anything that happened when their children were in view. And this kind of resonates back with a lot of these things and a lot of women's desires to be and maintain and they can never separate their role of a mother, because that's all that they're focused on. Impact of intimate partner violence over parenting over time. The ones in green here changed in a positive direction. So women over the year talked about their ability to be present. One woman said, my stress, my anxiety, my depression, it was caused by the abuse. It affects me not being able to give my children my all. I'm easily agitated. But a few mothers were able to describe their positive parenting with their children. They said that they were able to compartmentalize the abuse and to keep it separate from their parenting, and they were able to be even more affectionate with their children. This actually improved over time. And the ones in the blue remained stable over time. Throughout all 3 interviews over the course of a year, women continued to describe some challenges with parenting, and specifically around discipline. Some women said that they were reluctant to discipline their children because they didn't want to go too far and they didn't want to hurt them. Other women were afraid of hurting their children in the same way that their partner had hurt them. One woman said, I'm still scared for both, lost my place. One woman said, I'm always, when I discipline him, worried that I'm being like my ex. I'm afraid I will become abusive more than disciplining him. And then I think if I don't discipline, I'm going to let him get away with everything. The element of overcompensating and overprotecting came in for a lot of women. Some women described they're trying to make up for all the things that their children endured in the family. So they're giving them probably too much. Other women said that these led them to be much more overprotective. One woman said, I'm more overprotective of my son now. I watch everything that goes on around him, and I nurture him more, probably sometimes too much. Learned behavior, the one in orange, decreased over time. So women described a lot about how their children's learned behavior affected how they behaved toward them. One woman said, it's affected my ability as a mother because my kids saw my former partner put me down. They've learned that behavior. One woman said, I think it made it a lot harder. She said, my daughter saw my partner, what he did, and it caused her to have some bad behaviors. She regularly heard him call me an idiot, and she actually calls me that sometimes. And women expressed their concerns about their children taking this into future relationships. Women said that I worry a lot about my kids seeing the abuse. I worry that my son will take on this behavior, and I'm worried that my daughter will eventually allow it. Women also talked about self-doubt and really second-guessing their parenting and often relying on family or friends or even professionals to assure them that they're still being a good mother. And some women said the abuse has no impact. One woman just told me, she said, I've never let my role of mother be affected by it. My children come first, and they always have. And the last protective factor is social and emotional abilities, and I realize we're right at time. Parent and child-focused interventions, one of the things that I've also done, the Domestic Abuse Project, which is been serving children and families in the Minneapolis area for more than 40 years. They have what they call a parenting program, but it's actually designed for women whose children are in a therapy group, a 12-week group for exposure to intimate partner violence, and mothers are actually focused on gaining understanding about what their children have experienced within the home. Mothers are encouraged to increase their capacity to mentalize and empathize and support their children in making meaning of their experiences. And the goal is to really increase parental attunement, and that can facilitate the attachment support the child in the needs of the aftermath of violence. And so women highlighted 3 things. They talk a lot about the improvement in the communication between themselves and their children. One woman said it's now something that's able to be talked about. There's no shame anymore. Before, it's just like we've got to keep everything hush-hush because we have family secrets. There are no more secrets now. Everything is out in the open. Women also talked about increasing their understanding and awareness. One woman said, it helped me to open my eyes a lot more to know how parenting my child after the abuse will be difficult, but it will be better. It has helped me to understand how to look at my children's point of view of the abuse and to better parent them to the best of my ability. And women also talked about, although of course it was in a group setting, it wasn't the focus was really to develop their parenting skills or to really, but of course being in that group, you develop solidarity and strength. And one woman said, I felt like a failure for allowing us, herself and her children, to remain in an abusive situation for so long. As we talked and we shared over the weeks, I realized I wouldn't judge any of these others as harshly as I've judged my own parenting. I feel a little less guilty and stressed about parenting now. And then we were going to discuss all of the ways your work enhances the promotive factors of parents.